He knew what was right for his people. He knew that the Constitution guaranteed us our rights, our liberties, our agency. And so he recognized that sometimes we have to stand up and say, this isn't right. And President Benson talked about those kinds of things all the time.
Welcome to Come Follow Me. Today we're going to talk about the Doctrine and Covenants, section 102 through 105. Some really interesting pieces of history at this point. So 102 is the setting up of a council, like a high council in a state. Really important organizational thing that happens here. And it's because sometimes difficulties come up that is beyond a bishop's scope, and they don't need to go to the prophet, right? So you're starting to see more of the formation of the church. So historically, that's a very important event, really important event. It's good to understand how that works and the beauty of something like that. But at the same time, we're still having trouble in Missouri. The Saints have been driven out of Jackson County. They're in Clay County. Fortunately for them, Clay County citizens were willing to let them come for a while. They didn't want them to move in permanently. They didn't want them to buy property, but for a while, for a little while. So they had some leeway to be able to have some place to be, but they didn't have homes. A lot of times their crops had been burned, their animals driven off. They were pretty destitute. And they were writing to the governor, and they were trying to get redress and all the things that you're supposed to do when such a thing happens. The problem being that those who were leading the charge were judges and preachers and all of these things. So a couple of the brethren come up to let them know in Kirtland what's going on. And when they come, they speak to the council, this high council in Kirtland. And Joseph's response is, I'm on my way to go take care of my fellow church members. He didn't let anything get in the way of his willingness to defend truth. He didn't worry about whether the government was going to work with him or not. He didn't worry about if it was going to hurt the church or whatever, right? He knew what was right for his people. He knew that the Constitution guaranteed us our rights, our liberties, our agency. And so he recognized that sometimes we have to stand up and say, this isn't right. And President Benson talked about those kinds of things all the time. So they decide, then the council votes, and unanimously they approve that action. And then we receive section 103. 103 is the gathering of Zion's camp. How many people are they supposed to have? 500. Okay, they need to gather 500 men. That shouldn't be very hard. There's thousands of people, members of the church now, right? It should be. I mean, it's not easy because they're asking them to do something hard. Mm-hmm. And in Kirtland, they're fairly new settling there, and a lot of people new settling there, so they had to make sure they had things to take care of their families, their wives, their children. They actually planted gardens and crops so that while they were gone, their families could be taken care of, so that they weren't destitute. And then there were churches in a lot of places. Sometimes when I was studying the history, I thought, okay, well, we have Missouri and we have Kirtland. But we forget there's still people all the way back east. There's people in all those cities around. And so they organize to send out some of the brethren to invite these men to donate money and to sign up to be a part of Zion's camp, trying to get 500. And the Lord says, if you can't get 500, then 300. If you can't get 300, do not go with less than 100. Right? So how many do they end up with total?
200, I think.
Slightly over 200.
It's like 206.
Something like that, 206, 207. They also had some women with them and a few children. The women help with some of the cooking and other things around the camp. So anytime you have that kind of movement, you generally have some women. Even when they headed off the Mormon battalion, same way. Some women went with them to help with some of those items and duties. And they begin their march at the beginning of May. So the revelation to organize is in February. They begin their march at the beginning of May. Some of the people still aren't ready to go. Go ahead.
Well, it was interesting to me thinking about some of the people that came along, because Joseph is leaving and he sends Hiram and Lyman White to go around in Ohio to other congregations. Mm-hmm. And there was one man, he hadn't even joined the church yet, but he's like, if they're willing to do this because God told them to, I might as well get behind it too.
And he didn't join it, but he did later join the church.
Right.
So it was definitely effective in his conversion to the church at some point. But the problem being, why weren't they able to raise 500 men? What was going on?
Very specifically, the people in the East were not willing to come down and help.
Right. Right. In fact, that's what the Revelation in 105 talks about is they're saying, well, let their God take care of them. So their sin is in not helping their brethren. He says, you have a responsibility to the poor and you're not taking care of them.
Yeah.
That's a big deal.
And I believe, was it Wilford Woodruff? I think he was from the East, and he was one of the few that came down.
Yeah. And a brand new member. He was baptized at the end of December of 1833. And they're starting this call for men in 1834. So also a brand new member who comes and is part of Zion's camp.
He actually asked partly, he's like, what do I do? Because I have all these business affairs that I need to kind of clean up a little bit before I come up. And partly tells him, he's like, do all within your power.
Yep. And he really did it. Now, he wasn't even married yet. He didn't marry till later. But it was just really interesting to see how some people heed that call. I am needed, off I go. And we have to remember that sometimes today the same things happen. We need to be ready to go and assist and help others and do what's right. So, anything else to add to this? Okay, did they go down and fight?
No.
Why not?
Because the Lord told them not to.
Yeah. So they had some really interesting experiences. One of the men on the march is Sylvester Smith. I knew I'd get a reaction out of Joseph for that. Tell me about Sylvester Smith. He's not related to Joseph.
He's a pill.
He's a murmurer. He's a murmurer.
Kind of whiny.
A little bit. He's got a little bit of a hot head. He is a leader in the church.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't say that he was a bad man, but he had a murmuring disposition, and this was not good. So all along, sometimes they didn't have enough food, so he'd complain about the food. Joseph's dog made too much noise. He couldn't sleep. He complained about Joseph's dog. And what did this do to the camp?
It kind of put them in a spirit of contention.
Right. Not kind of. It really did. Put them in a spirit of contention. And what does that do? When you're on the Lord's errand, what does that do?
A lot of different problems started coming up.
When you have the spirit of contention, obviously you don't have the Lord's Spirit.
That's right.
You can't do his work if you don't have his spirit.
That's right. So that's the issue. And so Joseph was reminding them, he was calling them to repentance. And at some point he said, the Lord is going to curse this camp because of this spirit of contention. And eventually that is what happened. Now, one of the things that I thought was really interesting is they kind of had a song that was their song. It's called Hark, Listen to the Trumpeters. And Brigham Young and Joseph Young would often be the ones who would sing it for the camp. Now, as they got closer to Missouri, there were spies. There were people trying to stop them, people trying to get in their way. This wasn't, this was definitely not an easy task. But when they got to Fishing River, they were approached by some armed men who had a large mob on the other side of the river, and they were going to take them out. They basically told them that was going to be the case. And Joseph said, just stand still and watch the work of God, right? What happened that night?
A giant storm. Like out of nowhere kind of storm. And both rivers ended up raising about, I think it was 40 feet.
Really a lot. Before the men could even get back across from the mob, right? What happened to the mob? What happened to Zion's camp?
Zion's camp went to a building and stayed overnight. The mob was in the storm and the rain, and they were really pelted.
Yeah, most of them went home.
Rain, I believe it was also kind of hailing.
It was big. And if I remember right, one of them described that
you could see this little bit of a cloud over there that just like and rolled in. I mean, it was just such a fast-moving storm, and it really dumped on them. One of the miracles of it is their ammunition and their guns of Zion's camp. Do you remember that?
I know that they were using powder, so if it gets wet, it's totally useless.
It didn't damage their weapons. They were still able to use them. Really, really amazing. And yes, they did. They found it was an old Baptist chapel, I believe, that they went in and spent the night in to give them some shelter from the storm because it was crazy. All right. So one of the reasons that they felt they could go that way as well is that the governor of Missouri, it was Daniel Dunklin, had said he would support them. If they could bring some men in to help, he would support the saints in being able to get back their property and go back and live on their property in Jackson County. He reneged on that. As Zion's camp came closer, he was too much of a politician to make good on his word because he was worried about the mobs and his own ability to stay in office and his own safety. So he refused to send the militia to help them. He said that would just start a war, so I can't do that. And so not being able to raise enough people, not being able to have the governor's help, all of those things led to Zion's camp being disbanded. Is it a failure because it's disbanded?
No.
Why not?
Because in the end, a lot of those faithful people that went to Zion's camp ended up being chosen as leaders in the church, and I think they called some of the apostles and stuff like that.
So it was truly a trial of their faith.
You know, we have to look at it. The Lord doesn't let anything go to waste. It was a time of trial and testing for everyone.
Exactly.
Who was going to answer the call, who was going to put themselves forth and be like, yes, we're willing to fight.
Right.
And who was going to listen when he said, we're not doing it.
Right. Joseph, what do you want to say?
Well, I just remember someone confronted Brigham Young later and said, man, what a failure that was. And he said, no. We had Joseph with us for over, what was it?
A 6 to 8 week period.
Yeah, we had Joseph with us for this long amount of time, and what we were taught and what we learned on that trip. I would gladly do it again.
Right. He was constantly teaching them. They literally were learning at the feet of the prophet of this dispensation. So
Well,
what a beautiful blessing. Yeah.
One of the things that they came across was a body that was buried there.
That's right.
That was a Lamanite, and so they understood that the Lamanites had come up that far. So it wasn't something that was happening down in Mexico, but it was happening in the United States.
They found then Joseph Smith prophesied. He said his name was Zelph.
Yeah.
He was a white Lamanite, and he died from an arrow between his ribs. Right. He had a broken leg at some point. You could see that in the bones. But they also found the burial mounds and some altars, 3 altars there. So they knew that they had found some pretty special places, and he foretold or prophesied that these were actually Nephite and Lamanite from the battles. So it was really really interesting what they were finding, and really love the work of Wayne May and Rod Meldrum and all the things that they've done in learning about these mounds and all the things that they have uncovered with it. It's amazing work, really interesting to watch and listen to. Because we know that this is the land of Joseph. This is the land where Lehi came, where his descendants lived and died, right? So that was also a very interesting thing that they found along the way too. I'd forgotten about that. Thank you for bringing that in. Now, in Missouri, that's when their cursing came. Cholera hit the camp, and cholera is a very horrible disease and a very deadly disease. And several died from that, including Joseph's other. So Joseph had 2 cousins who came on this, Jesse Smith and George A. Smith. George did not die, but Jesse did die, and that really broke Joseph's heart. At one point, Joseph tried to turn the plague from some of them. He tried to give them blessings. And the Lord struck him down instantly, and he got the cholera too, because he was not allowed to remove the cursing God had placed. So many of them survived it, but also several died. And it was really an interesting learning experience for these men. Some of them who didn't have families maybe even stayed in Missouri. Most went back home. But all of the original Quorum of the 12 and the Quorum of the 70
Were selected from that group.
were a part of Zion's camp.
At the end of 105, when it talks about there have been many called, but now is the time for those who are chosen. I think that's at least in part what it's referring to.
If you've been liking our videos, give us a thumbs up. Subscribe, and if you want to receive notifications, hit the bell. Also, find and like us on Facebook. We hope to see you next time.